Oh, welcome everybody, and this is the FANG International Special Interest Group. Today we have David Edick with us. He is he's a principal at Core Global Advisory, which is a consultancy that focuses on political risk, commodities, market strategy. He's spoken to us before, and he's very graciously offered to come back. He's got lots of experience. In a lot of areas of trade, investment banking, and NGO relations in Russia. He also has extensive experience in Mexico, among other things. I won't go through his whole bio, but you kind of get the idea. He's also been past president multiple times at the San Diego World Affairs Council and has served on a number of different similar types of capacities over the years. So without much ado, I know he usually has a lot to cover, so I'd rather give him the time than me taking up the time on talking about stuff like that. So David, take it away.
Thank you, Chris. It's a pleasure to be here again. Financial Executives Networking Group is always a good audience, and indeed, there's a lot to cover. So a war that broke out, that from the Russian perspective, from the Kremlin perspective, shouldn't have lasted any more than a week. We're coming up to all of 22, 23. It's a full 2 years now that this is going on, and it's been full of surprises. Tides have risen and fallen, and the tide is on the move again once more. And as time has slid by, the context of the war has changed, and I would say that we're moving into really challenging stuff, some tough decisions that the West will have to make, the United States will have to make, governments. People can have their perspective and opinions and their actions, but the easy stuff, if you can call it that, is passed. That includes for Ukraine, I'm sorry to say. But jumping into it, I'm going to share my slide deck now. All right, so update on the war in Ukraine. Cutting right into it, during the summer of 2023, the buildup to the summer of 23 was anticipation of a Ukrainian counteroffensive against Russian forces occupying large portions of eastern and southeastern Ukraine. This counteroffensive was to be armed with German and American equipment, in addition to what the Ukrainians had. A great deal of influence by NATO on the planning and organization for this campaign. It turns out, though, that the Russians were very well prepared on their end. I don't have the graphic for it, just flat ran out of time, but there are maps out there showing the multi-layered defensive lines that the Surovikin line that the Russians, General Surovikin, organized and had executed into the field, and I would say dominated by enormous minefields, minefields on a scale that had not been seen certainly since the Second World War. And NATO doctrine and American experience in the combat field doesn't deal with mines very well. And it turns out the Ukrainians went in and got really chewed up in the first portions of the offensive campaign, and ultimately dumped a lot of the NATO doctrine and went basically to protect their people, because they were getting slaughtered in these minefields. And the first couple of days, on the order of 20% of the equipment that had been donated or was put into play was destroyed. So enormous losses. And really what this highlights is that this is a war of attrition. The advantage goes to the defender. And just pointing out, about 20% of eastern Ukraine is held by Russia today. At the beginning of this counteroffensive and after it, the green zone, small green zones showing Ukrainian advances, and small red zones showing Russian advances. This map is about 3 weeks old, showing the timeline for the whole war, starting in the upper left-hand corner, initial Russian invasion, large-scale Russian losses, additional Russian losses. But by the time it got to late fall, after the mobilization in Russia and kind of a rethinking about what the war was, and the level of the competency for fighting this war on the Russian side has been epically bad. That's one of the things that's actually keeping the Ukrainians in this thing. And if the Russians could actually fight a 21st century war, the losses would be much reduced, and they would be able to advance considerably further. But by the time it got to be late fall last in 2022, basically that's where the land exchanges quit. That was the extent of Ukrainian advances, really, and the Russians haven't really been able to do much advancing either. So it's a static war. It's very much World War I style in the electronic age, and we'll get into that later. But one of the things that, going back to 2022, February, March, April, sanctions, devastating losses by Russia in the field, epic losses of equipment and men. The expectation was that sanctions and external forces would essentially crash the Russian economy, and that ultimately military losses and then human losses and the collapsing economy would force the Russians out of Ukraine and somehow sue for peace. That was always a bit of dreaming, and what it does is it shows a consistent lack of understanding of what Russia is. A lot of mythology out there. It's its own place, and it's those that underestimate it do so at their peril, and that continues to be the case. So after looking here at this graphic, the blue line showing a composite of services, the red line, and about 2/3 of the Russian economy is service-based, manufacturing and mining, with the manufacturing here. So after the initial shock of the sanctions, the financial crisis, companies leaving Russia, the breakdown of trade, the Russian economy actually recovered rather quickly. In the fall of 2022, the mobilization took several 100,000 working age men out of the economy all of a sudden, causing a shock, actually a recessionary shock in the service economy. But rather, within months, the Russian economy had rebounded from that. Starting in late 2022 and through 2023 has been a very strong year for, for Russian manufacturing, and that's really armaments manufacturing. By and large, the Russian economy is flat, but for armaments manufacturing, and they have gotten their act together, increasingly so. Lots of criticism about the lack of technology. They've burned through a lot of the stores of the Soviet era. But as I'll get into in later slides, much of the 21st century war that's being fought in Ukraine now is, a lot of this stuff is off the shelf now. So, most of your Apple phone is, if Apple phones were made in the United States, they'd cost 3 times as much, and we probably wouldn't have them. The big issue okay, so one of the shocks coming out of the invasion and the financial crisis and sanctions and all was was a tremendous spike in inflation in Russia. The financial shock was met by dramatic increases in interest rates at the central bank to keep money in place. By and large, it was pretty effective. Rates came back down, inflation came back down, but starting in the late spring, inflation began to rise. And a previous presentation, I think, with this group in July, I was showing really strong increases in the money supply in Russia, and it was just flashing red that the economy was overheating. Short of labor in the manufacturing and in services, but just putting more money into limited and reconfiguring supply chains, and also reconfiguring, new choices for what you want produced, really produced, surge inflation, which was met ultimately by a steady and then a spiking decline in the value of the ruble relative to the dollar. Things almost got out of hand in late July and early August this past summer. And you can see here, Russian central bank began increasing interest rates. And in December, interest rates were increased to 16%. This chart is from December 15th. You can see, if you look closely, the peaking of inflation. 16% interest rates. This is quite a margin for real interest rates, and it is having a significant impact in Russia, very much squeezing but it's having results. Oops.
So my screen looks dark. I don't know if everybody else is looking that way.
No, I can see fine.
Go.
No, we can see, but the slides are moving very quickly.
Yeah, I hit the wrong flipping button here. Damn it.
I'm trying to catch up.
All right.
Can you see an exchange rate screen?
Yes.
Yeah.
Anybody not see an exchange rate screen? All right, so the dollar ruble rate, looking here on the right side of the chart, showing that after stabilization in 2022, after this terrific collapse in the value of the ruble, solid stabilization, but then a steady weakening that in the July August period really accelerated, and once it approached 100, that's when the decision was made to increase interest rates to defend the ruble. Mandates were put on the exchange of hard currency earnings with the central bank. You couldn't hold it in abroad or in a bank, although many did anyways. But the export earnings were required to be turned over, and it worked. The combination of all of that has stabilized the value of the ruble around 90. There's a war on, and yet the federal budget situation is actually continues to be quite strong, surprisingly strong. Usually at a wartime, you're running big deficits. And this is the effort of the oil sanctions, price cap, et cetera, was to somehow degrade the Russian financial capacity to fight this war. Well, that hasn't worked. I mean, the numbers are really quite clear with that, and that ultimately on the battlefield it's quite obvious, so that's a little harsh to call it playing games, but at some point somebody's going to have to get serious about this. In Russia, December is the month when money gets spent out of government budgets, in particular the federal budget. and the numbers for December 2023 are likely to be pretty large. You know, in terms of, you're looking at this, it's all measured in trillions of rubles, and in terms of GDP, you think in terms of consistently running primary budget surplus of 1 to 2%, even as this war is going on, with a sharp slide into deficit, say in December. But the taxation, one, there's a flat tax in Russia for one, so, and the focus has been heavily on resource taxation. There's been a lot of room, always has been a lot of room to reconfigure taxation if oil and gas taxations revenues were not enough, but they are. It's turned out to be enough, and the other parts of the budget, social services spending and all, have been squeezed in favor of security-related spending. But the idea that Russia's budget is under pressure, well, you know, it's all relative. You know, I mean, everybody's budget's under pressure, right? Crude oil exports have been pretty consistent. From the beginning, from when the war started to today, at least in terms of volume, both crude oil and product shipments ultimately totaling around 5.5 to 6 million barrels a day. Product almost as large as crude exports. What has changed is the destination. Most Russian crudes are now headed to Asia, with Turkey showing some pretty good growth. In Asia, India has been the new customer on the block. Oil discounts allowed for Russian oil sales in that market, when previously the logistics costs were prohibitive and kept most Russian crudes out of the Indian market. What's interesting is in the last couple months, though, last couple of weeks really, there have been difficulties in getting Russian crude into India. Part of it is the shrinking discount, pretty dramatic shrinking of the discount, but also issues with currency, the payment side of things. Those of you who were on earlier this year, I think it was this group that I talked about the financial implications with the dollar, the yuan, the ruble, etc. India wants to buy oil for rupees, but it's not really a convertible currency by any measure. For political purposes, the Russians were willing to take very large quantities of rupees, so much so that I believe that it impacted the ruble exchange rate. And during the summer, it actually came to where the Russians threatened to stop shipments to India. What's happened recently is, with additional sanction pressure, particularly on the UAE, the ability for India to set up accounts payable in dirhams, UAE dirhams, which is linked to the US dollar. So dirham is a serious currency, and that's Dubai and the markets that go around that. It's a well-run place, and the dirham is tied to the dollar. So if you can have banking and exchange services, why not? So, but the pressure US has pressed on the UAE and has made it more difficult. So anyways, there's a sudden inability of Russia to sell crudes off of Sakhalin Island, which is actually where India's single largest foreign investment is in Sakhalin 1. And a fair amount of crude coming out of Sakhalin does head to India from the Russian Far East, but now that's stalled at the Straits of Malacca, and the Chinese there's been talk of the Chinese picking it up, but right now there's quite a bit of crude in tankers at sea waiting for a destination. This graphic here showing, I just want to bring you over here to Kepler, showing a significant decline from November to December in crude flows into Russia. And with the deteriorating oil market, price market ongoing, Russia is finding competition from Saudi and Iraqi crude in India. That competition is getting stronger. Saudis cut their official sales prices east of Suez just earlier today, I believe. Significant price cuts. So it's not all going really, really well for the Russians on this front. And India is pursuing India's interests the best they can. Showing here Russia's the yellow line. You can see that the discount, this gap here reflecting discount to market price, that discount has faded. And there is, in the press, the Indian officials prefer to talk up these slipping price discounts. Well, I thought I had a graphic in there on that. That the slipping price discounts are the big factor in Russian crude sales into India slowing. But obviously, there are complicating factors. That all said, export earnings for Russia the last couple of years have 2022, 2023 up to January 7th of 2024 have been pretty consistent. Now, about half of Russia's exports are fuel products, oil products, gas. Half. The other half is other stuff. So that's important to recognize. Russia continues to run a large trade surplus, a large current account surplus, and running that current account surplus is a real challenge, because where do you bank it in a world full of sanctions? So there are arguments that have been made out of the fuel sector in Russia saying we don't need these exports. And that's something to take on board. It's so far, I mean, the guys in the Kremlin and their that network, they want the money. They can pocket it in different ways. And the sanctions have been one of the great contributors to lawlessness. I mean, this is like prohibition on steroids, and I know that Al Capone was arrested for tax evasion and everything, but for anybody that knows anything about American history and American culture knows the presence and impact of organized crime in this country. And organized crime really got its start with prohibition. And, once you get the money in the bank, you can do all kinds of stuff. So I think that this is a terrible thing for Russia, but it's also a terrible thing for the world. And the whole sanctions thing has had, at best, a short, marginal impact. And I'm not even talking about the environmental impact of burning fuel to send tankers halfway around the world to a different destination. But in terms of the stated goals of degrading Russian capacity, financial capacity, and degrading Russian capacity in the battlefield, pretty obvious. They had not been working. So what's next? And looking again here at the price discounts, in those early days when there was self-sanctions, companies didn't want to do business with Russia. And again, when you're in the crude business, you're purchasing 2 to 3 months in advance. It takes time to purchase, to load a tanker, and then for a tanker to go some distance in the world. You don't go down to 7-Eleven at the corner and buy a tanker of crude oil. You're looking at $80–100 million worth of investment, and it's just the time to execute the logistics is real. That all said, you can see that the discounts faded, sanctions hit again, but the discount is narrowed considerably, and I've seen no indication. I mean, yeah, the Russians could be earning more than they are, but the whole point was to degrade capacity, not to have them, have less than more. I mean, it's things have not gone well in recent months with relations between Ukraine and the EU. The EU countries, the European Union is totally supports Ukraine in this war, and Poland has been a big friend. However, there are points of tension, one with the grain trade coming out of Ukraine, not being able to export out of the Black Sea ports reliably. Even to this day, it's bottlenecked. Tremendous flows of Ukrainian agricultural products flowed into Eastern Europe, supposedly for export on, but it really complicated things for farmers in Eastern Europe. And those farmers vote, and they have their own issues, their own pressures. And while you could support the neighbor next door, there comes a point where that no longer is a viable issue. It's also been an issue in the trucking business. Ukrainian truckers travel across the continent, are very competitive, and maybe the most competitive, at least in terms of price. But these local or regional issues have become an increasing impediment to relations. I mean, the Poles are one of the biggest friends of the Ukraine in terms on the weapons side of things, and that'll continue to be the case going forward. But there are these other turbulences that are getting in the way. Ukraine has been increasingly successful in shipping grain out through the Black Sea and developing and expanding port structures at where Ukraine meets Romania at the Danube River, redeveloping facilities there. But still, the lack of rail capacity is a big handicap. I mean, you can have the biggest, sweetest port in the world, but if your rail capacity was not going there, you basically have to relay the rails, and that's a consuming thing. One good thing out of the ability to move cargo, though, out of this region, is out of that Danube Delta region, is Ukraine is increasingly able to sell processed metal products abroad. So the steel industry is again got an outlet to the world, and that's an important thing for sustaining Ukrainian industry. Looking here at the Black Sea, this if you see my cursor over here, this is the Danube Delta, and this is the area in which Ukraine has been redeveloping ports. There are three large port areas that were part of a UN Turkish brokered deal that allowed inspected ships to come and go out of these major grain ports in Ukraine. That deal expired late fall last year. Just wasn't working for the Russians. But I bring this up here, one, to show the position of Korea, but to look at the Black Sea. I bring this up because both Ukraine and Russia depend a great deal on commercial traffic in the Black Sea. Russia is the world's largest exporter of wheat by far. And Russia is also a large exporter of oil out of the Black Sea, out of Novorossiysk. That also ties in via pipeline to the Tengiz field in Kazakhstan. So the Kazakhs, they export a considerable amount of Chevron, okay, is one of the big players in the Tengiz field. They export out of Novorossiysk. So both countries have a lot to lose if commercial cargo is weaponized. If that becomes a factor in the war directly, I mean, it has been for the Ukrainians, but they're increasingly getting a way out because they can sail through national waters of Romania and Bulgaria. These are NATO members, and that would be a complicating factor for Russian attacks on the ships. There have been mines placed, which have been a bit of a complicating factor. But by and large, the cargo traffic out of Ukraine has been picking up. But this is a danger going forward for global markets, both in terms of oil products, and grains. If this turns into a combat zone, and it could, but there's a lot of resistance, say in the West, the United States and elsewhere, to keep Kiev from pressing their advantage, if you will. And they do have an advantage, a maritime combat advantage in the Black Sea, in my book. So they'll keep that from getting out of hand. Meanwhile, back at the ranch, the shift from pipeline gas coming out of Russia into Europe, the shift to closing that off. A lot to talk about there, but I'm not going to. The United States has been the primary beneficiary in selling LNG into Europe. The problem for the Europeans, though, is that LNG is more expensive than pipeline gas. There's the cost of liquefaction, and there's the cost of transportation. And that's a permanent change, whether the LNG is coming from the United States or elsewhere in Europe or elsewhere in the world. The trade-off between pipeline gas and LNG is an ugly one. And European industry, especially energy-intensive industry, I mean, this is a pretty big shock, and it's not coming back. So the Europeans have got some significant adjustments to do. Markets have worked. The cure for high prices is high prices, and the business sector, corporate sector, has not used expensive gas and have done their manufacturing elsewhere and either import into Europe or just do exporting from other countries. But there have been tremendous savings in the use of natural gas in Europe, and the corporate sector has been out front by far. But there's another side on that balance sheet, and the manufacturing in Europe. This is in Germany. This is a pretty serious hit. Big change. What this war has become is it's a combination of drone warfare and electronic warfare, a transparent battlefield. Talked about in journals for years. Here it is. This is the deal. And there's nothing like, I mean, NATO's unprepared to operate in this space. The United States has kind of toyed around with it. We're not prepared to operate in this space. The Ukrainians, followed by the Russians, have pioneered the use both of military design, uncrewed aircraft systems, and commercial. So, I mean, there's the stuff that's for the military, all the fancy designs and the big budgets and everything. But then there's just essentially buy it off of Amazon. I mean, in Russia, the ozone e-commerce, you can get anything from anywhere, and so you just purchase the parts and you create your own design, and you put the parts together and you weaponize it with some explosives, perhaps, a combination of weapons and intelligence gathering. So tactical reconnaissance and surveillance. So visibility on the field. Anything you do is going to be visible. So that's a big change. Real-time intelligence. Adjusting artillery fire, providing communications relay. And this is part facilitated by things like Starlink and satellite communications, but not entirely. It does offer the opportunity to do short and long range strike on the battlefield and drop repurposed munitions, against enemy equipment personnel. I'll tell you that my stomach for watching videos on Telegram from pro-Ukrainian channels and pro-Russian channels, I'm done with that. I have nightmares from seeing what I've seen, and that's enough. So just realize that this is very personal. I mean, they're dropping drone, grenade from a drone, and most of these are suicide drones where the design is one way. They fly one way, and then they hit their target. So there's no most of the stuff's never coming back. So what? You hit the target. But it gets down to where the targets are individual soldiers, and some of the video is striking. So I mean, we're in the U.S. and the West, we're kind of used to, drones. When you put an explosive on the bottom, you fly it one way into something. $99 for this setup. Flight. So first person view essentially is you have an operator who, with this equipment, drives the drone using these goggles and this transmission device. And if you've weaponized that drone, the operator can do all kinds of things. And if you just do some search on Google, FPV headset, all kinds of stuff pops up, page after page after page. And again, the Ukrainians were really the first to do this, and it was in-house. It wasn't advice from NATO or from USA or anything like that. This is indigenous creativity, and the Ukrainians, especially urban Ukrainians, like urban Russians, are technologically proficient. And in the early days of 2022, Ukrainian drone warfare was part of Ukraine's considerable battlefield advantage, in the sense that while the Russians may have had numbers, the Ukrainians they were adroit and capable. And you have here little copters, carrying an rocket propelled grenade round. Okay, and the tank has lots of armor on the side, but from the top doesn't. Same for all other vehicles, or if you're flying over a trench, you have trench warfare. One way you deal with trench warfare is drones, and I mean that's where the tough videos come in. We're used to thinking primarily of aircraft drones, air drones, but the Ukrainians have really pushed the envelope with maritime drones. These are uncrewed systems. Some of them are surface ships. Some of them are underwater. This Magura class, these were crowdfunded on the internet. These here on the right, this was part of a crowdfunding effort. It works. And this was one of the units lost on Crimea. War is immensely wasteful stuff, and the scale of the material that is consumed and destroyed in this war is mind-boggling, and it's one of the shocks for Western militaries and for civilian populations. Just to really understand how expensive war is. I mean, we spend money on a military, on weapons, on defense. and sometimes it's defense, sometimes it's offense. But it's basically peacetime stuff. And when Iraq and Afghanistan were going on, there were trillions of dollars were spent, and this is a qualitatively different war. It would be, for the U.S. to participate in it, it would be fantastically expensive, and the draft would be on. The Russians were able to figure this out too. One of the premier manufacturers of drones in Russia is Zala Group. It's part of the Kalashnikov Group. For those of you that Kalashnikov may ring a bell, as a famous AK-47. They have a division that produces unmanned aerial systems. This Lancet drone turned the tide for the Russians. You talk to any Ukrainian military people, and they will tell you how devastating an impact that this particular system had. It wiped out the advantage that Ukraine had developed in the field. So the combination of transparency and weaponized response, of very close quarter weaponized response, made combat particularly expensive, particularly bloody for Ukrainians, and it caused them to change how they were fighting. And Zala has a family of like 6 different drone systems, from very small things, very small, literally, quadcopter that you go down to the, Best Buy and you pick it off the shelf, to something like the Lancet, which is considerably more expensive. Again, most of these are one-way mission vehicles. Electronic warfare, and this is another crucial part of what has become a growing Russian advantage in the field. But the Ukrainians aren't standing still on it either. They have their own electronic warfare capabilities. Now, much of the equipment that's provided from the West, say like HIMARS rocket systems or Excalibur satellite-guided artillery systems, they depend on GPS. And GPS can be messed with via electronic warfare. The Russians have their own GPS system called GLONASS. The Chinese have theirs. The Europeans are trying to come up with theirs. GPS is not the only game in town, but the main point is that electronic warfare interferes with this capacity, and you can spoof a target, meaning that the rocket lands someplace it wasn't planned, out in the field somewhere. But basically, it blinds some of the most highly regarded weapon systems that the West has provided the Ukrainians. Picture of some of the, I mean, it's almost like a caricature of electronic warfare. Now, with the electronic warfare has become such a factor, both for the Ukrainians and for the Russians. And with the Russians having the advantage here, I don't think that there's anybody that studies this that doesn't see the Russians having an advantage in electronic warfare. What it's going to do, though, is it's going to change how drone and other these uncrewed systems, instead of having first-person view, an operator flying a drone into a target or something like that, drones and equipment are going to have brains of their own. They're going to have to be able to guide themselves. So having onboard mapping or recognition, image recognition tools, will be crucial, because those systems can really be autonomous. Most drones are unmanned, but they're not autonomous. And electronic warfare is going to drive the move toward true autonomous vehicles. And that both Ukrainians and Russians have a lot of capacity in that area. I will say that one of the primary target, actually, this latest wave of missile attacks from Russia against Ukraine, the talk is the missiles that land in cities and blow up coffee shops and kids in coffee shops, or that are targeting electronic infrastructure. In fact, the primary targeting right now is Ukrainian military manufacturer, arms manufacturer, systems manufacturer. That's the primary target. And new weapons are coming onto the field. All's fair in love and war, particularly war. And if you don't have something, you can buy it from somebody else. There's no, to be honest, there's no shame in it. It's war. Shame is checked at the entrance. But this is the latest drone system out of Iran. The 238 system is a jet-powered drone rather than a piston-fired. The piston-fired systems were Ukraine had become very effective in shooting down cruise missiles and these drones. What has become particularly effective, continuing effective, but where the Russians are heading more, is using ballistic type missiles, which can be defended against with the systems such as Patriot, but they've been using up Patriot inventories at a tremendous rate. But now with the funding problems in U.S. Congress, the ability to pay for Patriots out of storage, and manufacturing is being planned for like next year for Patriot missiles. I mean, the Ukrainians are finding themselves in a particularly tricky spot. This is actually, if you could almost go back to World War II and think in terms of buzz bombs, this is the same kind of speed, but the maneuverability and the low altitude of a system like this, the piston-fired drones, you could shoot those down with an AK-47. But these higher speed systems, you need some sort of assisted fire or rocket to take down. And rockets are very expensive and increasingly hard to come by. Patriot has turned out to be particularly effective in this war. One of the new things that's come to the block is North Korean rockets. This really was a bit of a surprise to me. I didn't expect that the Russians would buy into North Korean equipment. A lot of the artillery shells, the quality is abysmal. Reporting out of the field is artillery shells exploding in the barrel. It's not a good thing for an artillery system. You have a shell explode in the barrel, you're out of business. If you survive, but you're out of business. It's been a big issue. But what's intriguing and has just happened here in the last week, basically, last 10 days, has been the arrival of North Korean Hwasong 11G missiles. These have a range of around 400 miles. It's around 500 kilometers or so. 350 miles, 500 kilometers, half a ton warhead. These are solid fuel rockets, short range ballistic missiles that have a flattened arc, a flight arc, which makes them particularly challenging to hit. and that includes with Patriot systems. So it'll be interesting to see. It's worrisome. I don't know how much capacity the North Koreans have to deliver these systems, but they're in the field, and I suspect there will actually be North Korean specialists in the field involved in this. But this is something to watch in the weeks, say the next 6 weeks or so, as to how much of this equipment ends up in the field. And unlike North Korean manufactured artillery shells, this system is North Korean rockets got laughed at for a long time, but they have gotten very good. There's maybe some technology leakage from abroad, even from Russia, because there are oh gosh, there's the Russian system, and it escapes my memory. There's a lot of similarities to that system between the Hwasong 11. It can be launched from a truck, can be launched from railroad cars. It's actually a serious system. Meanwhile, Russia used to have one of the world's largest suppliers of weapons, and that has come to I wouldn't say a sudden stop, but very rapid stop. And it's been a problem for India, which is dependent on Russian military supplies. Russian military manufacturers are being used in the war at home, and where there are gaps, they're importing where they can. I mean, that's a war. I mean, Ukraine has its own arms industry, its own inventory from the Soviet days, and that's primarily what was used to fight the Russians in the first year of the war, despite all the talk about javelins and all that. It was primarily what the Ukrainians had on hand. As they began to burn through that equipment and ordnance, they began to get stuff from abroad. So, I mean, that's just the way it works. The next 2024 is supposed to see the arrival of maybe a couple dozen F-16s into the theater for Ukraine. There are Ukrainian pilots studying now. Currently, frontline Russian jets have considerable advantage over the older Soviet-era jets that the Ukrainians fly, and it allows the Russian jets to make standoff strikes, to be at a distance, out of range, and to launch missiles into combat or into cities. The F-16 could allow that to could take some of that advantage away. But I warn against getting overdone about this. I mean, in the West, in terms of supplying equipment for Ukraine and talking about Russian systems, the two commodities I think that are in greatest supply are testosterone and hubris. And that's almost entirely by people that are not in the field, either never been in the field or, just really ginned up on Western systems. It turns out that battlefield consumes equipment, Western or otherwise. And much of the Western stuff, requires a level of cleanliness and maintenance that is not generally available or commonly available in Ukraine, for example. One of the issues that is being talked about is that where the air intake is on the F-16, and where it's at during how the airflow works during landings and takeoffs. The F-16 is vulnerable to debris on the runway. And this is not like an inconvenient, a rock goes off the windshield out on the freeway. You take a rock into a jet engine, and that engine is toast. And that plane is going to be grounded for a long time. Think in terms of probably months, because you have to source the engine. Of course, maybe you pre-positioned engines, but it's turning out a lot of this Western equipment that's sent over there. You have to be able to service it. You have to provide the parts. You have to have the expertise to install it. But the key is you got to have the parts. And this maintenance issue of Western equipment in Ukraine has been a big issue, a big problem, and underrated. So the idea that sending in a bunch of F-16s, this is not top of the end equipment anymore, but it would give some help to Ukraine. I just think it's transitory, and I think it's very much overrated. So, since the war started, the United States has sent upwards of $75 billion worth of military and humanitarian budget aid to Ukraine. It's a lot of money, maybe not so much in the scheme of U.S. military budget or the U.S. budget as a whole, but it's a lot of money. And the politics have gotten very strange. The Republicans are voting against arms packages proposed by the Biden administration, and are coming up with all kinds of interesting reasons why they do oppose. I would just say that when and if a Republican comes to the White House, it'll be a matter of hours before the tune changes. This pursuit of political advantage, the level of partisanship, is so profound, and I have conversations with people who are, calling into question this aid stuff. But I've known these people for decades, and it's like there's no Democrat can do anything good, and it's like after a while this gets old, and this similar kind of a disease on the left in the world of Democrats. And I'll just say that the United States, on the whole, has not seen the world well, certainly for a couple decades. And it's very much the case now. I think this is a very short-sighted, because the reasons provided for the hesitancy are pretty lame in the grand scheme of things. I think that there are big strategic issues that are not discussed yet, and we're going to need to think this through. But none of that's being discussed at this point. I'll jump to it as quick as I can. Now you're beginning to hear messaging coming out of the White House, out of Washington, about building up Ukraine's industrial capacity to provide its own military equipment. Because we want them to stand on their own 2 feet. It's some of the language coming out of this reminds me so much of Vietnam, and that we're going to stand up the South Vietnamese, and ultimately they'd be able to defend themselves against North Vietnam. Not that there's a whole lot of similarity between the wars, but there's enough, especially in terms of this language, and the language that's used by saying, well, if you don't follow through and support the Ukrainians, your credibility will be called into question. Maybe, probably, but power is a funny thing. Power is a sobering thing. And values are one thing, and strategic interests another, and the interplay is a challenge, basically at all times, and especially now. DC doesn't get it, I will say. So these huge losses that the Russians have had in the field, Kremlin doesn't care. By and large, most of the Russian public understands it, and it goes right past them. It doesn't affect them by and large. Rather, I've talked about this before, a depoliticized, apolitical body in the middle of the Russian population, about 50%, maybe more, they're unengaged. They're not just disengaged, but unengaged, and aren't interested. The liberal minority, it never was much of a factor. Let's just be honest. But the number 3 is an important one to take away. That by and large Russians are and this includes scientists and open-minded people that I've worked with in the past and continue to communicate with. There is an imperial nationalistic thread that they're in for. Yeah, this is who we are. We believe this. This is what we're. This is good stuff. And it's imperial centers tend not to see themselves. That's another topic. But by and large, the administration misses the fact that the losses of the loss of blood and material on the Russian side are not a factor for the Kremlin. They are not a factor in Russia as a whole. And it's going to require, a much harder nosed approach. I mean, it's either going to get much more direct involvement. I mean, if it's that important, where are the U.S. forces? Okay, well, obviously that'll be a complicating factor, right? I mean, I could set up a situation where the U.S. Is fighting directly with Russia, and that could get messy, and I understand that. But there's the other side of this, which is, there's a whole spectrum between doing nothing and fighting. There is this space by which there is talking is part of the whole package. It's not anybody that's thinking all or nothing. It's simple-minded to these strategic issues where there's nothing simple about it. You have choices to make, and we're kind of painting ourselves into a long-term corner here in the U.S. Ukraine hopes to draft, the announcement should come out on Friday about how this is going to roll out. They want to draft 450,000. Curiously, in Ukraine, they're not drafting anybody under the age of 27. To be honest, I don't understand that. I don't know and that's something I have to look into, obviously. But it's always struck me as strange. But the Ukrainians have suffered enormous losses in this war, and it's, the propaganda and bias in the West is matched by the propaganda and bias in Russia, and to read the two spaces, I mean, it's not that you read both and you get an accurate picture of reality. What you do is you get an accurate picture of just how deep the BS is. And a lot of people are dying, or worse, coming home in pieces. The Ukrainians have Russia's 4 times larger in terms of population, 14 times larger in terms of GDP, a war of attrition. Does not work in Ukraine's favor. And some of the drafting gets to be tough. This occurred in Russia as well, but now this is beginning to come in Ukraine. The level of training is increasingly brief. Imagine somebody 45 years old, you get 2 weeks of military training and you're out in the field in the trenches. That generally doesn't end up very well, and it has not. So this is a big thing for Ukraine to come to grips with, is the consequence of the damage, the human material damage, and how to sustain in the face of this war of attrition, as your allies are kind of edging toward the door, or at least it feels that way.
Hey, David, I don't want to cut you short, but we probably ought to try to. I'm just looking at timing.
All right, so I'm gonna there are those that think that if Ukraine falls, there's going to be Russian bases up to right on the borders of a bunch of NATO countries. We can talk about it, but this western part of Ukraine used to be part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and one of the things that Putin is particularly angry about toward Lenin and the communists, you know, the USSR was a ideological construct. The criticism of Lenin was creating these these ethnic states. But what occurred at the end of World War I, as the wreckage of the Russian Empire was reassembled into the Soviet Union, was that pieces of the wreckage from the Austro-Hungarian Empire were bolted on to Western Ukraine. Long story. And Putin has a couple of weeks ago floated a beautiful piece of propaganda. He's talking to the nationalists that still are found in places like Poland, Hungary, and Romania that are interested in maybe. It's not a large population that wants these places back, but some. It's definitely divisive. And this old relationship of Galicia between Poland and Ukraine, this is a space that most Ukrainians and a lot of Poles are very uncomfortable talking about. This is a sore spot from the past. The pogroms, of which the Jews were targets big time, but the killings were thousands and thousands and thousands. The idea that Russia would re-expand into Central Asia and take back countries that used to be part of the Soviet Union, advocated, including by Alexander Solzhenitsyn before he passed away. China is not going to allow that. And in order for the Russians and the Chinese to have a working relationship, which the Russians want and the Chinese want, I do not see anytime soon, or even at all, Russia actually retaking countries in Central Asia. Kazakhstan has complicated ethnic issues to deal with, but by and large, I see this as a lesser. I don't see this as trouble going forward. Looking forward, in this is kind of a conclusion slide. There is a growing Russian material advantage. There is a shortfall in technology. Russia is technologically capable, but doesn't produce a lot of the hardware. They're very good at designing systems and software, but manufacturing is not a strong point for the Russians, particularly in technology. So they depend on supply from abroad, but using law or finance in the face of a war or profit motive is over time ineffective, and that generally has been the case here. Western aid to Ukraine personnel is depleting, and this is a real challenge. Look at just how this draft is going to work. I mean, just pay attention to the news over the next week or so to give you a good sense of how this is handled. And both the Zelensky administration and the military are very careful and even wary of talking about it in public. It's obviously a hot issue inside Ukraine. So it will be very important to see how this rolls out. Sanctions are a popular tool, but they have no meaningful impact on the battlefield. That's just the deal. I mean, we can argue about the what's happening along on the margins of the thing, but it's just not, it's not working. But what it is doing is messing the world up in a lot of ways, and that will have consequences down the road. Domestic politics is reemerging in Ukraine. with the Chief of Staff General Zaluzny's interview with The Economist, November, I think, calling the war a war of attrition. That was really kind of the biggest public shot across the bow of we have to start dealing with things realistically rather than having visions and goals and values. We're going to have to get practical. And that had created real tensions within the Zelensky administration. There are other active political people in Ukraine who are on the fringes of becoming much more active. A fellow named Arestovich is somebody to pay attention to. You may know of him, you may not like him. You may have criticism of it, but it's a large following, and I'm just seeing that the extraordinary unitary national movement of Ukraine behind and with Zelensky is beginning to show signs of some fracturing. My own view is that the US and the West need to think broadly in terms of security in greater Europe. If this war ends on the battlefield, increasingly it looks like it'll end up on Russian terms. And I'm not so sure that that's a great, I don't think that that's a great idea. Russia has become a different place than it was, and it's not the best. I think it's unfortunate. It's a tragedy what has happened. But some difficult decisions are going to have to get made, because as I talk with people, even this last week, what does success in the war look like? What's victory? Oh, victory is, that the Russian forces are evicted from Ukraine, and we have a unified country. We have our control of our borders. It's like, no. I mean, it's like, I think that's great to talk about, but that's not going to happen. So what's next? So this what's next is very uncomfortable, very unpleasant. And I don't see Russia or Putin coming to some sort of decision to negotiate with Ukraine, with Zelensky. I just don't see that. The only way that there's going to be any kind of discussions about any of this stuff is with the United States. And that's going to create some real discomfort from the Ukrainians. And right now we're putting the Ukrainians out front. But this is where power, this is where the strategic realities of powers come into play. And Ukrainians are in a very uncomfortable spot, and I recognize that. I just think that the more thinking that there is done in DC and in Brussels about how to deal with this emerging new world, and I really don't see much sign of it yet, but it'll happen. And meanwhile, we're driving the Russians and the Chinese together in a very big way, include the Iranians and now the North Koreans, and on that, contiguous countries. The United States cannot fight a war against the Russians and the Chinese at the same time. So what are we doing? I think realpolitik, it's crucial realpolitik come into play more in favor of this democracy versus autocracy talk. It's great to have ideas and values, but we're just going to have to get a whole lot more real than we've been for a generation. That U.S. national security, we're going to need to pay attention to needs versus wants. And those choices are not necessarily going to be easy. Thank you for your time, everybody. I've run long as usual, but thank you.